The air in the Caldwell mausoleum was colder than the November chill outside, thick with the cloying scent of lilies and unspoken resentment. It was a coldness I had grown up with, a polished, expensive frost that coated every surface of our lives. My father, Robert Caldwell, was the sun in my universe, the only source of warmth in that gilded cage. And now he was gone. I stood slightly apart from the others, my stepmother, Eleanor, and her children, Marcus and Isabelle, a solitary satellite cast out of orbit. Eleanor, a woman sculpted from ice and ambition, dabbed at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, a perfect portrait of grieving widowhood for the assembled Boston elite. Marcus, ever the heir apparent, stood stoic and broad-shouldered in his bespoke suit, while Isabelle sniffled delicately, her sorrow as curated as her Instagram feed. They were a perfect family. I was the relic, the ghost of a previous life, the daughter of my father's first wife, the woman he had loved before money and status became his new bride. My mother was an artist, a free spirit who had given me my name, Seraphina, and her love for all things intricate and beautiful. She had died when I was 6, leaving me in a world that valued stock prices over soulfulness. My father, bless his heart, had tried to bridge the two worlds. He was the one who saw my fascination with the tiny gears and springs of his own father's pocket watch and turned it into a passion. While Marcus was being groomed for the boardroom and Isabelle for the society pages, I was in the quiet solitude of my room, learning to become a horologist, a keeper of time. It was a profession that suited me, patient, precise, and largely invisible. Seraphina, do try to look a little less grim, Eleanor murmured, her voice a low hum of disapproval as she glided past me. It's unseemly. I said nothing. My grief was a raw, gaping wound, not a performance piece. I could feel their eyes on me throughout the service, the subtle glances that said, "She doesn't belong." They weren't wrong. I didn't belong to their world of calculated emotion and transactional relationships. My currency was sincerity, a coin that held no value here. The week leading up to the reading of the will was a masterclass in psychological warfare. I was relegated to my old rooms in the cavernous Caldwell mansion, a ghost in my own home. My workshop, a small sunroom my father had converted for me, was the only place I felt sane. Surrounded by the gentle ticking of a dozen clocks, the precise tools of my trade laid out like surgical instruments, I could lose myself in the miniature universes of balance wheels and escapements. Each piece I restored was a promise of order, a testament to the idea that even the most broken things could be made whole again. It was a comfort the rest of the house could never offer. The family dinners were excruciating. Marcus would dominate the conversation with talk of stabilizing Caldwell Industries, subtly positioning himself as the only one capable of steering the ship. Isabelle would chatter about canceling her winter trip to Gstaad out of respect, while simultaneously scrolling through resort photos on her phone. And Eleanor would watch me, her gaze sharp and assessing, a predator sizing up a negligible threat. Father always said Seraphina had a delicate constitution, Marcus said one evening, a smirk playing on his lips as he carved into a bloody piece of steak. More suited to tinkering with her little toys than the pressures of the real world. It's a charming hobby, Isabelle added, her tone dripping with condescension. Very quaint. Your father indulged you, Seraphina, Eleanor said, her voice the final, damning verdict. He had a soft spot for the unconventional. But as you'll soon learn, the world runs on practicality, not whimsy. I held my tongue, the words clawing at the back of my throat. I wanted to scream at them, to tell them that my tinkering required more focus and intelligence than their entire combined existence. I wanted to tell them that my father saw my passion as a strength, a discipline, not a weakness. But I knew it would be pointless. In their eyes, I was the odd, quiet girl, a sentimental footnote in the grand history of the Caldwell dynasty, and they were about to erase me. The day of the will reading arrived, gray and foreboding. We gathered in the office of Mr. Abernathy, my father's longtime lawyer, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with an expression of weary disappointment. The room was paneled in dark mahogany, smelling of old leather and even older money. Eleanor sat perfectly poised, Marcus next to her, a carbon copy of his father's posture but lacking his warmth. Isabelle fidgeted with her phone until Eleanor shot her a glacial look. I sat opposite them, my hands clasped in my lap, my heart a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat and began to read. The legalese was dense, a thicket of trusts and subclauses, but the intent became clear with brutal speed. The mansion, the portfolio, the art collection, the controlling shares in Caldwell Industries, it was all a meticulously constructed fortress designed to pass from Eleanor to her children. Marcus was named the new CEO. Isabelle was granted a trust fund that could finance a small nation. Eleanor was given stewardship over everything, the undisputed queen of the empire my father had built. My father's name was on the document, but the words felt like Eleanor's, each one a perfectly sharpened dagger. Then, finally, came my name. To my daughter, Seraphina Caldwell, Abernathy read, his eyes refusing to meet mine. I leave the sum of $50,000 to aid in the continuation of her chosen craft. A gasp, not of shock, but of insulted pride, escaped Isabelle's lips. $50,000. To them it was a tip, a rounding error. It was a calculated slap in the face, a public declaration of my worth in their world. But there was one more thing. And, Abernathy continued, a flicker of something, pity, regret, in his eyes. I leave her one personal item, a keepsake, from my own father, my old broken pocket watch, in the hopes that she might one day find the time to fix it. A wave of nausea washed over me. Marcus's lips curled into a triumphant smile. Eleanor's expression was one of serene victory. They had done it. They had not only taken my father's legacy, but they had twisted his love for me into a final, pathetic insult. The watch, our watch, the one he'd first let me hold, the one that started it all. He had always promised we would fix it together one day. Now they were using it as a symbol of my broken, worthless inheritance. Mr. Abernathy slid a small velvet pouch across the polished desk. My hand trembled as I took it. I didn't open it. I couldn't. The weight of it felt immense, impossibly heavy. Well, Eleanor said, rising gracefully, that seems to be everything. Marcus, we have a board to reassure. They swept out of the office without a backward glance, their victory absolute. I remained frozen in my chair, the silence of the room pressing in on me. Even Mr. Abernathy had the decency to look ashamed. Seraphina, he began softly. Your father, he wasn't himself at the end. Eleanor had his full medical proxy. I just nodded, unable to speak. His words were meant as a comfort, a way to tell me my father hadn't truly been the one to land this final cruel blow. But it didn't matter. The result was the same. I was disowned, discarded, and humiliated. That night, I packed my things. It didn't take long. My life was contained in my workshop. I carefully wrapped each clock, each set of tools, each tiny box of gears and hands. The $50,000 check lay on the bed, feeling like blood, money. I would take it, but only because I had to. They had left me with nothing else. As I was about to leave the room for the last time, my eyes fell on the velvet pouch. With a deep breath, I pulled the drawstring. The watch slid into my palm, cool and familiar. It was a beautiful, old piece, a 1920s Patek Philippe with a hunter case. But as Abernathy had read, it was broken. The crystal was cracked, the hands were frozen at 3:15, and the case was dented. It looked sad, defeated. a reflection of how I felt. Tears I had refused to shed in front of them began to fall. Hot and angry, I sank onto the floor, the watch clutched in my hand, and let the grief and rage consume me. It was a storm, a hurricane of betrayal that left me hollowed out and shaking. They had taken everything: my home, my security, my father's memory. They had left me with a broken trinket as a final screw you. Hours passed. The first pale light of dawn crept through the windows. The storm inside me had passed, leaving behind a strange and terrible calm. My fingers, acting on years of instinct, began to examine the watch. I ran my thumb over the dented gold casing, traced the crack in the crystal. I turned it over, and over. It was a complex piece of machinery, a miniature world of its own. And like any world, it held secrets. My father had taught me to see beyond the surface, to understand the hidden mechanics of things. "Everything has a secret, Sarah," he used to say, his voice warm with affection. "You just have to know how to look." My thumbnail found the lip of the backplate. It was a friction fit case, common for the era. I would normally use a special knife to open it, but I worked my nail into the seam, applying gentle, steady pressure. It resisted. It was stuck fast, probably from the dent. I pressed harder, my focus narrowing, the entire world shrinking to this single point of contact. With a soft click, the backplate popped open. Inside, the movement was a mess. The balance wheel was off its jewel, and a fine tracery of dust coated the intricate bridges and gears. It was a difficult repair, but not impossible. But that wasn't what held my attention. There was something else. Tucked beneath the movement, in a space that shouldn't have existed, was a tiny, folded piece of paper, no bigger than my fingernail. And beneath that, etched almost invisibly into the inner plate of the watch, was a string of numbers and letters. My breath caught in my throat. My hands began to shake again, but this time it wasn't from grief. It was from a surge of adrenaline, a jolt of pure, unadulterated electricity. I carefully retrieved the tiny piece of paper with a pair of tweezers from my travel kit. My fingers, clumsy with anticipation, slowly unfolded it. There were only 3 words written in my father's familiar, elegant script. "Time to fix." I looked from the note to the cryptic code etched into the metal. Time to fix. He wasn't talking about the watch, the insult, the final, pathetic gesture. It wasn't an insult at all. It was a message, a key. A cold, sharp clarity washed over me, displacing the last vestiges of sorrow. They thought they had buried me, but they had only planted a seed. They thought I was the quiet one, the fragile artist, the girl who tinkered with toys. They saw me as a broken, useless relic, just like the watch I held in my hand. They had no idea that a horologist doesn't just see broken things, we see potential. We understand that to make something whole again, you must first be willing to take it completely apart, piece by tiny, intricate piece. Sitting on the floor of my empty room, with the dawn of a new, terrifying day breaking outside, I looked at the watch, the note, and the code. And for the first time in my life, I smiled my stepmother's smile. It was cold, it was sharp, and it held the promise of a perfectly calculated, long-overdue reckoning. The game wasn't over. It had just begun. The first few weeks were a blur of logistics and quiet fury. I used a portion of the $50,000 to rent a small, anonymous apartment and a separate, secure workshop space in a nondescript building on the industrial side of town. The anonymity was crucial. The Caldwells, in their arrogance, would assume I had crawled away to lick my wounds, perhaps opening a small, sad repair shop somewhere. They would never think to look for me in a place without a prestigious zip code. My new workshop was my sanctuary and my war room. On one side stood my horology bench, a temple of order and precision with its magnifying lamps, lathes, and tiny gleaming tools. On the other side, I assembled my arsenal, A powerful new computer with encrypted hard drives, a bank of monitors, and a corkboard that soon became a chaotic tapestry of names, photos, and connecting threads of red yarn. The watch, my father's final gift, sat in a place of honor on my bench, its backplate still open, the cryptic code a constant, silent exhortation. Time to fix. The phrase echoed in my mind, a mantra that fueled me through 18-hour days. Fixing the watch itself was a task I reserved for moments when I needed to calm my racing mind. The delicate work of cleaning the movement, sourcing a new crystal, and carefully reseating the balance wheel was a form of meditation. But the real work was deciphering the code, L2C4P17AQR-DTH. It took me a week of frantic research, of diving into worlds I knew nothing about, cryptocurrency, shell corporations, digital ledgers, to even understand the syntax. ETH was the giveaway, the ticker for Ethereum. The code wasn't a bank account number in the traditional sense. It was a digital wallet address, a ghost in the machine. Getting access was the next hurdle. A wallet address is public, but the key to unlock it is private. My father wouldn't have made it easy. I thought back to his lessons, his love of puzzles and ciphers. Look at the whole mechanism, Sarah, not just the hands. The code itself had to be the key. L2C4P17. I tried it as a password. Nothing. I tried variations, birthdays, anniversaries. Nothing. The breakthrough came, as it often did at my workbench. I was staring at the dial of the broken watch, the hands frozen at 3:15. And then I looked at the code again. L2C4P17. It wasn't a password. It was a map. A treasure map hidden in the language of my father's business. He had hundreds of holding companies and LLCs, a labyrinth of corporate structures. I spent days combing through public records, cross-referencing company names with the code. L2, Caldwell Logistics, second subsidiary. C4, Crestview Holdings, fourth portfolio. P17, Project 17. It was a dead end. Project 17 was a defunct real estate venture from a decade ago. It made no sense. Defeated, I slumped back, staring at the corkboard. The faces of Eleanor, Marcus, and Isabelle stared back at me, smug and self-satisfied. I felt a surge of rage. I would not be beaten by this. I picked up the watch again, my father's watch, 3:15. It wasn't just a random time, it was an appointment. Third chapter, 15th page? No, too sentimental. What was my father if not practical? 3:15, March 15th, the Ides of March, a day of betrayal. He was clever. But what about the year? I scanned the list of his companies again, and there it was. Not Project 17, P17, Caldwell Properties 2017. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I searched the digital archives of Caldwell Properties for a transaction dated March 15, 2017. And I found it. A single, anomalous wire transfer for a significant sum coded under consulting fees. The recipient was a company I'd never heard of. Aquitaine Solutions. The reference code for the transaction? L2C4AQR. The final piece. The full private key. My heart hammered against my ribs as I entered the long string of characters into the wallet interface. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the screen refreshed. A balance appeared. My breath hitched. It wasn't just money. It was a fortune, a completely separate, hidden reservoir of wealth my father had siphoned off over the years. A dragon's hoard that Eleanor and her brood knew nothing about. But that wasn't the treasure. The treasure was in the transaction history, the notes, section of each transfer. My father had used this ghost wallet as his private ledger. It was a meticulous, damning record of every secret, every sin, every betrayal committed by his second family. He had been watching them, documenting their greed and their deceptions for years. He knew everything. He hadn't been a victim, not entirely. He had been building an ark, or in this case, a weapon. The $50,000 wasn't an insult. It was seed money. The watch wasn't a keepsake. It was the armory key. And he had entrusted it to me, the only one he knew would have the patience and the precision to see it through. A new kind of grief washed over me, sharper and more profound than before. It was the grief of understanding. He had been trapped, a man who had built a cage of wealth and then found himself locked inside it with predators. He couldn't dismantle it without destroying himself, but he could leave the schematics for his successor. My sorrow hardened into resolve. My father had given me a blueprint for their destruction. It was time to get to work. I would not be a sledgehammer. That was their style, brutal and crude. I would be a watchmaker. I would dismantle their lives with the same care and precision I used on a vintage movement, one tiny piece at a time, until the entire mechanism ground to a halt. My first target had to be Isabelle. Isabelle was the softest target, the one most insulated from the realities of the business world. Her entire existence was a performance, funded by the family name. Her currency was social capital, her brand built on an image of effortless charity and trend-setting glamour. She ran a foundation, the Seraphina Caldwell Foundation, named, in a touch of supreme irony, after Eleanor's mother, that hosted lavish galas to raise money for, well, no one was ever quite sure. The foundation's primary output seemed to be Isabelle's own press coverage. My father's ledger told the story. The foundation was a sham, a tax write-off, and a slush fund. Donations were funneled through a series of shell accounts and ultimately used to fund Isabelle's extravagant lifestyle. The couture gowns, the art purchases, the leasing of a private jet for a charity mission to St. Bart's. But the real secret, the one that would truly wound her, was more personal. My father had noted a series of payments to a boutique floral designer. The payments were small, but regular, and coded with a single word: lover boy. A quick cross-referencing search of Isabelle's social media from the corresponding dates revealed the man in question. Julian Croft, a handsome, struggling artist who seemed to appear at the fringes of her photographs, always with a look of doe-eyed adoration. He was also, I discovered, the exclusive floral designer for all of the foundation's events. Isabelle wasn't just embezzling, she was using the charity, a charity named for her own grandmother, to keep a boy toy. The perfect opportunity was coming up, the foundation's annual Starlight Ball, the crown jewel of the Boston charity season. It was Isabelle's personal Super Bowl. My plan began to form, elegant and cruel. First, I created a ghost, a fictional identity named Eleanor Vance, a disgruntled former employee of the foundation. I built her a simple but believable online presence, a LinkedIn profile, a sparse social media footprint. Then, as Eleanor Vance, I began to leak documents. Not all at once, just a trickle. I sent an anonymous tip to a well-known, aggressive local blogger who specialized in society gossip, along with a single, redacted bank statement showing a suspicious payment from the foundation to a company owned by Julian Croft. The blogger, smelling blood, took the bait. A blind item appeared. Which Boston socialite is using her family's charitable foundation to fund a much younger, aesthetically pleasing protege? Sources say the arrangement is less about philanthropy and more about floral arrangements. The item was just vague enough to be deniable, but it sent a ripple of speculation through the city's elite. I could picture Isabelle's panic, her frantic calls to her mother. This was a threat to the one thing she truly valued, her image. Next, I targeted the money. My father's ledger contained the routing numbers for the offshore accounts where the real money was hidden. 2 days before the gala, I made a series of anonymous reports to the IRS and the State Attorney General's office, flagging the foundation for financial irregularities and providing just enough evidence to trigger an automatic freeze on its domestic assets pending investigation. I timed it perfectly so the freeze would hit on the morning of the gala. The final piece was Julian himself. Isabelle's weakness wasn't just her vanity, it was her cruelty. People she deemed beneath her were treated as disposable. I tracked down Julian's studio address. He was talented, but his business was clearly struggling. I sent him a package, courier delivered. Inside was a cashier's check for $100,000, far more than Isabelle had ever paid him, and a simple, unsigned note. "She's about to throw you under the bus. This is for your talent. Get out now. A friend of your art." And just to ensure he understood the stakes, I included printouts of the foundation's real financial statements, showing how little of its money actually went to charity and how much went to Isabelle's credit card. The morning of the Starlight Ball, all the gears clicked into place. I sat in my workshop, a bank of monitors in front of me, watching the chaos unfold online. The news broke first. Assets of Lillian Caldwell Foundation, frozen amidst financial probe. The major sponsors, terrified of the bad press, began pulling out. The catering company, the orchestra, the venue, none of them could be paid. Calls to Isabelle went unanswered. Then, the gossip blogger dropped the bombshell, naming names this time. Julian Croft, it turned out, had a conscience. Or perhaps he was just pragmatic. He had given the blogger an exclusive interview, complete, with receipts, text messages, and a heart-wrenching story of being a pawn in a rich girl's game. He painted Isabelle as a manipulative, callous user, a portrait that was devastatingly accurate. The Starlight Ball collapsed in spectacular fashion. It was the lead story on the local news. Reporters camped outside the Caldwell mansion. Isabelle, who lived for the spotlight, was suddenly its victim. The articles weren't just about financial impropriety. They were about her character, her coldness, her use of people. In her world, that was a mortal wound. I watched a news clip of Eleanor, leaving her office, her face a mask of fury. She gave a curt, no comment to the swarm of reporters, but her eyes scanned the crowd, and for a moment I felt a chill. She was looking for the source, the architect of this humiliation. She was looking for me. Late that night, my burner phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. The message, when it came, was from Marcus. His voice was low, laced with a venom I had never heard from him before. "Sarah, I don't know how you did it, but I know it was you. You think you're clever, hiding in whatever little hole you've crawled into. But you just made a big mistake. You've woken us up, and now we're coming for you." I deleted the message. Let them come. They were looking for the quiet girl who fixed watches. They had no idea I was the one who now held the blueprint to their entire corrupt machine. I picked up my father's watch from the bench. I had finished the repairs. The crystal was replaced. The dent smoothed out, the movement cleaned and oiled. With a gentle wind of the crown, the second hand sprang to life, sweeping smoothly around the dial. Ticking. Steady. It was a beautiful sound. The sound of time starting again. Isabelle was just the first gear. Now it was Marcus's turn. Marcus was a different animal from his sister. Where Isabelle was a creature of gossamer and glass, fragile and easily shattered, Marcus was forged from the same cold, hard steel as his mother. He saw himself as a titan of industry, a visionary, the worthy successor to Robert Caldwell. In reality, he was a man propped up by his father's name and reputation. His confidence wasn't earned, it was inherited. His weakness wasn't vanity, but hubris. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that he was untouchable. My father's ledger painted a clear picture of Marcus's leadership at Caldwell Industries. While my father was alive, Marcus's authority was limited to a few subsidiary projects, small kingdoms where he could play at being king without risking the empire. It was in one of these, a forward-thinking but risky venture into sustainable energy technologies called Helios Innovations, that I found my weapon. Helios was Marcus's baby, the one thing he had built that was truly his own. He'd poured millions into it, touting it in board meetings and to financial journalists as the future of Caldwell Industries. The company's flagship project was a new type of solar panel, supposedly revolutionary in its efficiency and affordability. The problem, as my father's meticulous notes revealed, was that it was a complete fraud. The technology had never worked. The prototypes consistently failed, the efficiency numbers were dismal, and the manufacturing process was dangerously unstable. My father had discovered it a year before his health declined and had ordered Marcus to shelve the project, eat the losses, and move on. The entry in the digital wallet was dated and stark. M presented falsified Helios data to board. I shut it down. He is more concerned with appearance of success than success itself, a danger to the company. But Marcus hadn't shut it down. After my father fell ill and Eleanor took control, he had resurrected Helios. Driven by ego, he had poured more money into it, burying the costs in other departmental budgets. Worse, he had faked the data, the test results, the efficiency reports, everything, to secure a massive government grant and to lure in a partnership with a major European tech conglomerate, Viridian Dynamics. The deal was set to be finalized in a matter of weeks. It would be hailed as Marcus's crowning achievement, cementing his position as CEO and sending the company's stock soaring. Destroying Marcus meant destroying Helios. But I couldn't use the same tactics I'd used on Isabelle. A gossip blogger wouldn't scratch the paint on Marcus's armor. This required a different kind of precision. I had to attack his credibility, the very foundation of his power, from within the world he respected, the world of finance and industry. For 2 weeks, I became a student of solar technology and corporate espionage. I used the funds from my father's secret account to hire, through a series of cutouts and anonymous online portals, a private investigator in Germany to discreetly look into Viridian Dynamics' lead negotiator. I also hired a disgruntled former engineer from Helios. My father's ledger had conveniently listed the name of the man who had originally tried to blow the whistle to him, and paid him handsomely for a copy of the original damning test data. The pieces were assembling. The German PI discovered that Viridian's negotiator had a gambling problem. The engineer provided a thumb drive with spreadsheets and internal memos that proved, unequivocally, that Marcus knew the technology was a failure. The final element was delivery. I couldn't just dump this information online. It had to be a targeted strike. I chose the day of the quarterly earnings call for Caldwell Industries. It was a webcast, a stage where Marcus would be performing for investors and analysts, projecting strength and confidence. An hour before the call, my plan went into motion. First, the German negotiator received an anonymous email. It contained a video of him at a high-stakes poker game in Baden-Baden and a simple message: Viridian stock will collapse if they sign the Helios deal. The tech is fraudulent. We both know you haven't done your due diligence. Cut your losses. It was a gamble of my own, but a calculated one. Faced with personal and professional ruin, he would fold. Second, I created a meticulously crafted report, a professional-looking dossier complete with the falsified data Marcus was using and the real data from the engineer. I embedded it all into a secure, anonymous website. Then, I sent an email to a single, influential financial analyst at a top Wall Street firm, a woman known for her aggressive, no-nonsense approach. The email, sent from another ghost identity, was brief. You're about to listen to Marcus Caldwell lie to you for an hour. Here's the truth about Helios Innovations. Check the metadata on the files. The original creation dates tell the real story. Finally, I made my move on the bow. Company itself. Caldwell Industries had a system for anonymous whistleblower reports to its board of directors, a system mandated by corporate governance laws. It was meant for show, a box to be ticked. No one expected it to be used for anything serious. I submitted my report, The full, unredacted truth about Helios, directly to the board members just minutes before the earnings call was scheduled to begin. I sat in my workshop, the live feed of the earnings call on my central monitor. Marcus appeared on screen, looking tanned, confident, and utterly in control. He began his presentation, his voice smooth and reassuring as he ran through the positive and largely misleading quarterly numbers. "And this brings me," he said, a proud smile spreading across his face, "to the most exciting development at our company, our future. Helios Innovations." He launched into his spiel, weaving a fantasy of clean energy and market domination. As he spoke, I watched my other monitors. The analyst I'd tipped off began posting a series of cryptic messages on a private financial chat board, questioning the capital expenditures listed in the report. A seed of doubt. Then I saw the email I'd been waiting for. It was a news alert. Viridian Dynamics postpones partnership with Caldwell Industries, citing need for further review. The German negotiator had caved. The message would be, "Rocketing through the financial world right now." On the webcast, Marcus was oblivious. He hadn't seen the news yet, but some of the people listening had. The online question queue, usually filled with softballs from friendly analysts, began to light up with pointed inquiries about Helios. "Mr. Caldwell," the moderator read, a slight tremor in his voice. "We have a question from Anya Sharma, at Morgan Stanley. She asks if you can provide the raw, uncompiled testing data for the Helios panels, and can you comment on rumors that your European partnership is on hold?" For the first time, Marcus's confident facade cracked. A flicker of panic flashed in his eyes. He stammered, trying to deflect, talking about proprietary information and the normal ebb and flow of negotiations. But the damage was done. The sharks were circling. It was then that the board must have read my report. I couldn't see what was happening behind the scenes, but I could imagine the frantic, whispered conversations, the horrified looks. Marcus was mid-sentence when his earpiece crackled. He listened, his face draining of all color. He looked like he had been physically struck. "There appears to be a technical issue," he mumbled, his voice suddenly hollow. "The remainder of this call is postponed." The screen went black. It was over. The aftermath was a symphony of destruction. The stock, which had been climbing in anticipation of the Helios deal, didn't just fall. It plummeted. It lost 30% of its value in a single afternoon. The board of directors, terrified of shareholder lawsuits and regulatory investigations, moved swiftly. Marcus was suspended, then forced to resign in disgrace. The official story was creative differences, but everyone knew the truth. The financial press was merciless, running story after story about the Helios fraud, painting Marcus not as a visionary, but as a reckless, arrogant fool who had nearly destroyed his father's company. The hit was more profound than the one on Isabelle. I had taken more than Marcus's job. I had taken his identity. Without the title of CEO, without the cloak of Caldwell Industries, he was nothing. He was a failure, and worse, a public one. This victory felt different. It was colder, more satisfying. But it also carried a weight. I saw an article about the layoffs at the Helios division, hundreds of people losing their jobs because of Marcus's lies and my revenge. For a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of guilt. These were real people, not chess pieces. I pushed the feeling down, reminding myself of the years of quiet cruelty, of the coldness in their eyes at the funeral, of the calculated way they had tried to erase me. This was a war they had started. I was simply choosing the battlefields. My focus now shifted to the final, most formidable target, the Queen herself, Eleanor. She was intelligent, ruthless, and had the survival instincts of a cornered animal. She knew I was behind this. The attacks had been too precise, too personal. She wouldn't be ranting and raving like Marcus. She would be planning. She would be hunting. A few days after Marcus's ouster, a package arrived at my apartment building. I hadn't ordered anything. I watched from my window as the courier left it with the doorman, then retrieved it myself, wearing gloves. Inside the plain cardboard box was a single perfect black orchid, Eleanor's signature flower. There was no note. There didn't need to be. It was a declaration. I see you. I know you're there. The game had escalated. She was no longer waiting for me to make a move. She was making one of her own. The message was clear. The time for hiding was over. The final confrontation was coming. The black orchid was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. It was elegant, menacing, and deeply personal. It sat on my counter, a dark star in my small apartment, a constant reminder that Eleanor was not like her children. She wouldn't be toppled by a scandal or a financial blow. She was the root of the rot, and to kill the weed, I had to pull her out completely. For the first time since this began, I felt a sliver of fear. Eleanor was a ghost. She had spent a lifetime cultivating an immaculate public image while keeping her true self carefully shielded. My father's ledger, for all its damning detail on Isabelle and Marcus, was strangely thin on Eleanor. There were notes on her extravagant spending, her manipulation of my father's social life, her cold dismissal of his old friends. But there were no hidden lovers, no secret gambling debts. Her one vulnerability seemed to be her obsessive need for control, but that was a fortress, not a weakness I could easily exploit. Her message with the orchid told me she was now actively hunting me. I had to assume she had hired investigators, that she was using the full financial might of the Caldwell estate to unearth the architect of her family's ruin. My anonymity, my greatest defense, was now a ticking clock. I had to strike before she found me. I returned to the source, the watch and the wallet. There had to be something I'd missed, a deeper layer to my father's secrets. I spent days combing through the transaction history of the Ethereum wallet, looking past the obvious notes on Marcus and Isabelle. I cross-referenced dates, payment, recipients, and cryptic codes with old family calendars, my father's business records, anything I could find. And then I saw it. It wasn't a single explosive entry, but a pattern. A series of payments, made twice a year for over a decade, to a private medical facility in Switzerland. The sums were substantial, coded simply as EC Medical, EC Eleanor Caldwell. But Eleanor was famously, robustly healthy. She hadn't had so much as a cold in 20 years. The second part of the pattern was a set of smaller, but equally regular payments to a P.O. box in a small town in upstate New York. These were coded differently, with a single letter. A. What was she paying for? My first thought was some secret illness, something she was hiding from the world. But that didn't feel right. Eleanor would weaponize an illness for sympathy before she would hide it in shame. The secrecy suggested something else. I used a new set of ghost credentials to dig into the Swiss clinic. It was notoriously discreet, a place where the global elite went to get off-the-books treatments and to quietly manage their families' problems. The P.O. box was a dead end, registered to a shell company. The answer, I suspected, was not in a database. It was in the Betrayal past. My father had married Eleanor 2 years after my mother died. I knew very little about her life before then. She was, the story went, the widow of a French businessman who had died in a tragic yachting accident. She had swept into my father's life, a vision of European sophistication and strength. I hired the same German investigator who had helped me with the Viridian deal, this time tasking him with digging into Eleanor's past in Europe. Specifically, her first husband, Jean-Luc Devereaux. While he worked, Eleanor made her next move. A story appeared in a major Boston newspaper, a sympathetic feature piece on the beleaguered Caldwell family. It painted a picture of a grieving, widow and her children being targeted by a vicious, unknown corporate saboteur. It hinted at a possible connection to a disgruntled, unstable family member, carefully avoiding my name but drawing the circle tight around me. The article quoted friends of the family who described me as a recluse, quiet and resentful, a girl who never fit in. She was building a narrative, preparing the ground. If and when she found me, she wanted the world to see me as the villain. The pressure was mounting. I felt her closing in, the walls of my anonymity beginning to feel thin. Then, the email from Germany arrived. The subject line was a single word: found. The report was attached, and it blew the history I knew to pieces. Jean-Luc Devereaux had indeed died in a yachting accident. What the official story omitted was that he was not alone. He had a sister, Amélie Devereaux, and Amélie had not died. She had suffered a catastrophic brain injury in the accident, leaving her in a permanent vegetative state. Jean-Luc's will had stipulated that a portion of his fortune be used for her lifelong care. When Eleanor, his widow, inherited his estate, she also inherited responsibility for Amélie. Suddenly, the pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The Swiss clinic wasn't for Eleanor, it was for Amélie. It was the price of Eleanor's freedom, the one living link to her past, a secret she had to keep paying to keep buried. And the P.O. box? The investigator had found that too. It was rented by a woman named Clara Bennett, a retired nurse. A quick search of old hospital records revealed that Nurse Bennett had been on duty in the emergency room the night Amélie Devereaux was brought in. She was the loose end. The payments were hush money. A didn't stand for anonymous. It stood for Amélie. This was it. This was the secret my father had uncovered, the one he chronicled in his ledger, not with words, but with numbers. It was a secret of profound, monstrous cruelty. Eleanor hadn't just hidden away her disabled sister-in-law. She had built her new life on the foundations of that secret, erasing Amélie from existence so she could be the sole, unencumbered inheritor of the Devereaux fortune, and use it to ensnare my father. The revenge, when it formed in my mind, was absolute. It would not be financial. It would not be professional. It would be existential. I would give Amélie back the one thing Eleanor had stolen from her: her name. The stage had to be perfect, and Eleanor, in her arrogance, had already built it for me. She was hosting the annual Caldwell Foundation for the Arts Gala, her signature event, a self-congratulatory spectacle held at the city's Museum of Fine Arts. It was her attempt to reclaim the family's narrative after the disasters with Isabelle and Marcus, to project an image of resilience and philanthropic grace. She would be on stage, in the spotlight, surrounded by the city's most powerful people. My preparations were meticulous. I flew to upstate New York and met with Clara Bennett. The old nurse was terrified at first, but the years of guilt had taken their toll. She had letters, medical records, photographs of a young, vibrant Amélie before the accident. She had kept everything. She was afraid of Eleanor, but she was more afraid of dying with this secret on her conscience. I made her a promise. I would protect her, and I would make sure the truth came out in a way that couldn't be spun or buried. Next, I used a significant portion of my father's secret fund to make a massive anonymous donation to the Caldwell Foundation, large enough to make me the evening's primary benefactor. The donation came with one condition: that a short 3-minute tribute video, provided by the donor, be played to honor the spirit of forgotten artists. Eleanor, blinded by the size of the check and the prestige it would bring, agreed without question. The video was my masterpiece. It was not an attack. It was a memorial. It began with beautiful sun-drenched photos of Amélie Devereaux, a radiant young woman painting, laughing, sailing with her brother. It told the story of her talent, her passion for art, her life. It was narrated by a professional voice actress, with a gentle, compassionate voice. It spoke of the tragic accident, the loss, the life that was stolen. And it never once mentioned Eleanor by name. It didn't have to. The final frame was a simple, elegant text. Amélie Devereaux, 1968, present. A life lived in silence. Let her not be forgotten. The night of the gala, I was not in the audience. I was in my workshop, watching a pirated live feed of the event. I saw Eleanor take the stage, radiant in a sequined gown, her voice smooth as silk as she welcomed her guests. She looked like a queen surveying her court. And now, she announced, her smile beaming, we have a special tribute, thanks to the incredible generosity of an anonymous patron. A short film to remind us of why we are all here, to ensure that no artist is ever forgotten. The lights in the grand ballroom dimmed. The massive screen behind the stage flickered to life. The first image of Amélie appeared. I could see the feet of Eleanor on stage, her smile frozen, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. As the video progressed, as the story of Amélie unfolded, the confusion turned to dawning horror. Her face went pale. The camera zoomed in slightly, and the entire room could see her perfect composure shatter, her breath catching in her throat. The audience was silent, captivated by the beautiful, tragic story on the screen. They didn't know the connection yet. They just saw a sad story. But Eleanor knew. This was her ghost, her deepest secret, resurrected in front of the entire world. When the final words, "Let her not be forgotten," appeared on the screen, a single, audible gasp came from Eleanor. The camera held on her face, a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. And then, my final move. As the lights came up, every journalist, blogger, and person of influence in that room received a simultaneous email. It was from Eleanor Vance, the ghost I had created for Isabelle's downfall. The email contained the full story. The Swiss eye, clinic, the hush money to the nurse, scans of the medical records, and a link to the public record of the Devereaux inheritance, showing that Eleanor Caldwell, formerly Eleanor Devereaux, was the sole trustee of Amélie's care. The room erupted. Phones buzzed. Whispers turned to gasps. People turned to stare at Eleanor, who was still frozen on the stage, a statue of glittering panic. They weren't looking at a philanthropist anymore. They were looking at a monster. A woman who had hidden her disabled sister-in-law away for decades to protect her wealth and status. She stumbled back from the podium, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape. But there was none. The faces that had adored her moments before were now filled with contempt and disgust. Her carefully constructed world, her entire identity had been demolished in 3 minutes. She fled the stage. But there was nowhere to run. The story was out, unstoppable, a virus of truth that would infect every corner of her life. In my workshop, I closed my laptop. There was no elation, no thrill of victory, just a profound, quiet finality. I had dismantled the House of Caldwell. Gear by gear, Isabelle's vanity, Marcus's hubris, and now, Eleanor's monstrous secret. The mechanism was broken. I picked up my father's watch, now ticking perfectly on my workbench. Time to fix. The job was done. The revenge was complete. But as the adrenaline faded, a new, unwelcome feeling began to creep in. An emptiness, a silence where the ticking of my obsession had been. I had avenged my father. I had reclaimed my own worth. But what came next? What does a watchmaker do when her great work is finished? The fallout from the gala was apocalyptic. It was more than a scandal. It was a societal supernova. Eleanor's story was on every news channel, every website, every newspaper. The narrative I had so carefully crafted took hold. She was a ghoul in couture, a woman who had built her life on the silent suffering of another. The story of Amélie Devereaux, the forgotten artist, was the one that resonated, a tragedy that made Eleanor's actions seem unforgivably cruel. Legal proceedings began almost immediately. The Swiss authorities, responding to inquiries from French prosecutors, confirmed the existence of a long-term patient whose trust was managed by Eleanor. The state of New York began an investigation into the payments to Clara Bennett. The board of the Caldwell Foundation for the Arts, along with every other charity board she sat on, demanded her immediate resignation. Her friends, the ones who had filled her parties and praised her name, vanished like smoke. Society didn't just shun her, it excommunicated her. Marcus and Isabelle were caught in the blast radius. Their names were now synonymous with fraud and cruelty. The Caldwell name, once a symbol of Boston Brahmin power, was now toxic. Marcus, already disgraced, became a complete pariah. Isabelle, who had been trying to piece her social life back together, found every door slammed in her face. They were financially secure for now, but they were culturally bankrupt, ghosts rattling around in a tarnished, gilded cage. I watched it all unfold from my quiet apartment, a distant, unseen God observing the world I had remade. There was a grim satisfaction in it, the clean, cold feeling of a problem solved, a mechanism restored to its proper order. But the fire of my rage, the fuel that had burned so hot for so long, was gone. In its place was a vast, hollow quiet. My corkboard of vengeance was bare, the red strings cut, the faces of my enemies now just sad, defeated people on a newsfeed. The revenge was complete, but the victory felt strangely hollow. I had thought destroying them would bring me peace, a sense of justice for my father. But justice is a legal term. What I had achieved was something more primal and more complicated. I hadn't just exposed their sins, I had obliterated a family. My family. A week after the gala, Mr. Abernathy called me. His voice was different now, stripped of its weary professionalism and filled with a kind of awe. The remaining, untainted, assets of my father's estate, the parts not tied up in Eleanor's control or the company's collapse, were being transferred to me as the sole remaining heir of sound mind and character. It was a fortune beyond anything I had imagined. It was the inheritance they had tried to steal, and now it was mine. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I just felt tired. I spent the next few months in a strange limbo. I moved out of the anonymous apartment and bought a small, beautiful brownstone in a quiet neighborhood, a place with old-world character and a garden. I built a new workshop on the top floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that bathed the room in natural light. It was everything a horologist could dream of. Yet I found myself unable to work. My tools felt foreign in my hands. The steady ticking of the clocks I had collected, once a comfort, now seemed to mock the stillness in my own heart. I had spent so long focused on taking things apart that I had forgotten how to build something for myself. One crisp spring afternoon, I found myself driving with no destination in mind. I ended up at the cemetery where my father was buried. I hadn't been back since the funeral. I stood before the polished granite stone, the name Robert Caldwell, carved deep into its surface. "I did it, Dad," I whispered to the silent air. "I fixed it. I fixed everything." But had I? I had exposed the truth. I had punished the wicked. But the cost had been immense. My father's company was a shell of its former self. His name was now forever linked to the scandal of his wife and her children. This wasn't the legacy he would have wanted. In that moment, I realized the final hidden gear in the mechanism of my revenge. It wasn't about destroying them. It was about what I would build in the ashes. My father hadn't just left me a weapon. He had left me a responsibility. The emptiness began to recede, replaced by a new, unfamiliar feeling. Purpose. I didn't want the Caldwell Empire. I had never wanted it. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity, but this time it was constructive. I met with lawyers and financial advisors, not to plot destruction, but to create. I liquidated my inherited shares in Caldwell Industries, ensuring the money would go into a trust for the employees who had lost their jobs in the Helios collapse, providing severance and retraining programs. I sold the monstrous Caldwell mansion and used the proceeds to establish the Amélie Devereaux Foundation, a legitimate arts charity dedicated to supporting artists with disabilities and those whose voices have been silenced. Its first act was to arrange for Amélie to be brought back to a beautiful private care facility in the French countryside, where her remaining family could visit her, ensuring her name would be associated with grace and art, not with tragedy and imprisonment. As for Eleanor, Marcus, and Isabelle, I left them to the fate they had created. Their legal battles would drain their finances, and their social exile was a prison of their own making. My revenge was complete not when they were ruined, but when I no longer thought about them at all. Finally, there was the matter of the secret wallet, the dragon's hoard. It was the seed of my revenge, but it was also the last remnant of my father's pain and secrecy. I couldn't build a future on it. In a final, cathartic act, I transferred the entire remaining balance to a dozen different international charities, doctors, Without Borders, the World Wildlife Fund, organizations dedicated to building, healing, and preserving. Then, I deleted the wallet, erasing the ghost ledger from existence forever. My life became quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the silence of loneliness, but the stillness of peace. I returned to my workshop, the sun streaming through the windows. I picked up my father's watch, which sat on a velvet cushion on my bench, its gold case gleaming, its hands sweeping time forward with perfect, steady grace. It was no longer a key to an armory. It was just a watch. A beautiful, intricate machine that had been broken and then made whole again. A legacy of a father's love and a daughter's journey through darkness into light. I sat at my bench and picked up my tools. My hands were steady now. I began work on a new piece, a complex astronomical clock with a movement of my own design. It was a celebration of order, of beauty, of the patient, intricate work of creation. As I fitted the first tiny, gleaming gear into place, I felt a genuine smile touch my lips, perhaps for the first time since my father's death. The clocks in my workshop ticked in a gentle chorus around me. Each tick was not a measurement of time lost, but a promise of time to come. My time. And I had all the time in the world